My name's Samantha Foley. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the University of Reading. It's great to welcome you all. For those regulars in the audience, and I hope we have some of those that come to us for our public lectures, you're very welcome. If this is your first time, equally, you are super welcome, and I'll talk to you at the end a little bit about what other opportunities there are in the future for coming to something at Reading. So I'm delighted to introduce the fourth lecture of our 2018-19 public lecture series, Britain's Housing Crisis, Designing Future Homes and Cities. Luckily we're going to get some suggested solutions to that particular crisis as well, so possibly better than the Brexit situation at the moment. I'm sorry, I just had to get that in because I'm sure we've all been looking at the news and trying to work out what we think is going on. This is a topic pretty close to my heart. I look after the investment portfolio for the university here. And actually, I was just sort of talking to Flora earlier that actually in my previous life, I worked on the London 2012 Olympics and the housing that followed from that, from the legacy side of things. So it's super to be here, and I'm super interested in the topic. So tonight's lecture will be given by Professor Flora Samuel from the School of the Built Environment here at Reading. We'll learn how Britain's housing system is broken, but Professor Flora Samuel will also deliver her manifesto for a better housing future. She'll show us how designing better homes and cities is crucial to resolving the current crisis. That's not the Brexit crisis. Before I pass on to our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about Flora. So Flora Samuel is the first Royal Institute of British Architects Vice President for Research. She's a Professor of Architecture in the Built Environment at our new School of Architecture here at the University of Reading, which is based down at our London Road campus for any of you that are interested to have a look at that. Before this, she was the first female head, and we were just having a conversation just then, Flora and I, about how many women are actually represented in this industry, and I'm sure she'll cover that a little bit as she talks to you. So she was the first female head of the highly ranked University of Sheffield School of Architecture. Over the last 10 years, she's focused her attention on the way in which architects evidence and communicate their value, and this was the focus of her most recent book, Why Architects Matter, which was published in 2018. She's passionate about supporting the development of research and practice. In 2016, she set up the Research Practice Leads, a group of over 30 practices that meets quarterly to advance the cause of architectural research. Their current focus is on the development of a social value toolkit for architects to demonstrate the well-being value of buildings. She also leads the Place strand within the UK Centre for Collaborative Housing Evidence, a partnership between academia, housing policy and practice. Before I hand you over to our speaker, a couple of points I'd just like to make you aware of. If you're an avid Twitter user, which I'm sure you all are, please join the debate tonight and use our hashtag #UORLectures. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our tonight's speaker, Professor Flora Samuel. Round of applause, please.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I'm very honoured to have such a big audience to talk about such a thorny problem. I'm not promising to solve the housing crisis, but maybe to give a slightly different perspective on it from what you might be used to. So I'd just like to ask you, who here is concerned either about how as a young person, about where you're going to live in your future, or as a parent, where your kids are going to live, or as a grandparent, where your grandkids are going to live? Who here is worried about that? Okay, pretty much everyone. Okay, because I was saying to Jenny, who organised this talk, I actually come across kids at school now with a glass jar on their shelf, saving their pocket money towards their houses when they're older. That's how bad I think, I feel. I've got teenage kids. I think it really weighs upon them that they just don't know or don't feel they're ever going to have a place to live of their own. Just curious, do you know what the average age of leaving home is? Any guesses?
30,
35, yeah, 30 is 30. It's in that region, and you all seem to be pretty phlegmatic about that. Maybe you've experienced it, you have the T-shirt. But it certainly wasn't like that in my day. Yes, so we have a real situation about where people are going to live. So I'll start off with talking about the problems. Don't worry, I know it's dwell on them for too long. Housing crisis, what crisis? It's not just economic, and it's not just about affordability. It's an environmental crisis. The quality of housing we're producing is really bad. And I exemplify this by a really bad building here. But also socially, our housing and our cities aren't working very well. The lecture's title suggests I'm going to talk about cities, but frankly, I've got quite enough with housing, so cities are going to be a bit of a secondary thing. I hope you'll bear with me on that, although happy to do cities another day. So, quick overview, I'm going to talk about the problem and some solutions. And these are the solutions I'm going to posit, beginning with, as Sam alluded to already, the issue of design. I think design is key to unlocking all of this. So here's a nice bit of housing, Proctor Matthews, Horsted Park. Okay. And I think at the end of it all, I'm going to finish up with talking about leadership, because I think leadership ultimately is the crux of it all. And I apologise if this talk is a little bit political. It's a bit difficult to talk about housing without getting political. Although housing is the #1 domestic problem recognised by the government. That's their highest priority. So the problems, well, first of all, of course, we have climate change. 12 years warning to limit climate change catastrophe, warns UN, if you weren't aware of that. That's the background to all of this. And it may seem as though things are okay here. I know in Reading we had the hottest February ever day, but we're doing a research project with people in the Philippines, and this is a photo taken by my colleague Richie over there, and this is what happens in the Philippines 20 times a year. This is climate change for them, and it's just not funny. So what we're doing here is ethically terribly wrong for other people. Housing supply, more than 1 million families waiting for social housing in England. Well, just imagine what that equates to in people living in bed and breakfasts or other really unsalubrious situations, families moving around, education disrupted, all that sort of stuff. I promise not to show you too many graphs, but house building is getting better, but got a long way to go, an awfully long way to go. And a lot of this goes back to this woman, Mrs. Thatcher. I promise not to be too political, but so this is her when she was setting out on her right to buy mission, whereby council houses, people were allowed to buy their council houses at a reduced price to become homeowners. And this was a real turning point of difficulty, really, in the whole housing scene that we have here, and I'll come back to it. Shame by Europe, number of houses built this year. UK population, ridiculously low, the amount that we're building. And at the same time, UK houses cost almost 8 times the average earnings. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of all of this, but let's just remind ourselves. And this is really bad in kind of gentrified areas like London, where key workers and young people are absolutely squeezed out of the place. So this is not just about housing, it's also about workplaces, and we've got a real problem about where creatives can work in Reading. They have nowhere to live and they have nowhere to work, and you end up with an homogenous, miserable city which has got pret-a-mangers on every side of Trafalgar Square, that sort of thing. So we have a situation there. And we really, really are lacking in choice in housing. A lot of the housing that we are offered is new build, looks like this, but actually people don't want to live in that. They'd rather buy a rundown Victorian terrace. Something really going wrong with that. I just put this slide in to remind myself to mention, just in case you're blaming architects for all of this, I'd like to just remind you that although we have no reliable statistics, probably about 9% of the built environment has an architect involved. So that's 91% potentially is built by builders, developers, people with no official training in design. So just in case you're thinking about blaming architects for stuff, just remember that. So as a result of the... after the right to buy happened, there was the erosion of council house building, and the space was taken over by the volume house builders, and the volume house builders obviously being private enterprises who are out to make a profit and to make their houses as cheap as possible, really, in order to give good payouts to their shareholders. So there's an issue around that, and there are some good volume house builders and there's some bad ones. And then, of course, we have so people can't afford to buy a home, so they have to go to rentals. And there's an enormous dissatisfaction with private rental sector. And my daughter went out and tried to rent a place. It was filthy, mouldy, everything fell down. And whenever the mould happened, if she was lucky, the landlord came and painted over the mould. Now, that's not good for health. And I think that there are many young people and many older people who have had this experience of private rental landlords. In Europe and other places, there's a culture of having long-term rents, so families can live their life in a rented accommodation quite happily. They can have dogs, they can have cats, they can have children. It's their home. But we don't have a setup like that in the UK, so bringing up a family in a private rental situation is very, very precarious. At the same time, of course, we've got houses are getting smaller, and I tried to put my headlines from a range of different newspapers, even though the prices are going through the roof. And there's a lot of research about this. Essentially, UK homes are the smallest homes in Europe. I'm sure the people aren't smaller. So the real issue about that, and I think an issue that is becoming more and more key is housing for older people. I took this photo at the weekend of assisted living down my road, and actually older people do not want to live in homes like this necessarily. They're very costly, very wasteful, and don't offer different kinds of lifestyles. I'm sure we all want to have different kinds of lifestyles. We have to do better. Right, so so then the government's recognising this with national strategy as well. So I mentioned health, mould, all of these things, not good at all. And this comes with environmental problems. Britain's bad air, a bigger threat is obesity, because buildings cause roughly 50% of airborne pollution. And then, of course, in the summer, the planning regulations, they overlook heat, so developers will build buildings that have no recognition for overheating in the summer. We know what climate change projections are going to be in the next 20, 30 years, but we're not designing for them. So homes are getting more and more useless, and overheating, useless little windows, useless ventilation, people dying, actually, at the end of the day. And communities are not really being built properly to enable people to meet each other, to get out and enjoy community life. And loneliness is bad as for health as long-term illness, we learn. And then, of course, in Reading, rough sleepers, homelessness, strongly connected to poor health, really, really bad. And even children living in poverty, and we know that poverty is growing so much, are much more likely to be ill in later life. And then last of all in my series of miserable things, we have Grenfell Towers, where so many people tragically lost their lives, and has been shown really to be symptomatic of a terrible lack of leadership in the construction industry, where nobody takes responsibility for long-term quality, safety, and environmental performance. So so lots of things to be a bit gloomy about, but I'm going to suggest some ways out of this. So, some solutions. And again, I just want to remind you that a crisis, what crisis? It's not just about economics and affordability. We have to help the environment, and we have to provide social value in our developments. And I put this picture of the Colville estate up by Carucific Carson, because there's a lot of work going on at the moment, which is, these are private towers which have been built in a council estate in order to pay for upgrading and more homes for affordability. And I think a lot of this has got to be achieved realistically. If we're going to achieve anything around housing, it's got to be achieved as a public-private partnership going forward. Okay, I'm going to start off, I think the first issue is defining design value. Because nobody knows what design value is, it gets left out of everything, and everything just goes flying back to the triple bottom line to the bottom line of economics. So as part of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, we did a whole review of what does it mean? What does design value mean at neighbourhood scale? So this is one of the things we're working on at the University of Reading, and we concluded that design value was what is commonly known as the triple bottom line of economic value, environmental value, and social value. You need to deliver on all of those in a sort of holistic way to achieve design value and indeed to achieve sustainability. Now, these are luckily are the same things that the National Planning Policy Framework is looking at. It's looking at economic, social, and environmental. And it's also how the government makes its decisions about what it's going to spend money on. It used to be just money, but actually, March last year, the government changed it to economic, social, and environmental, which was definitely a very positive thing, although nobody really knows how to deal with the social side. So, types of design value, it'll make sense why I am talking about this in a minute, I hope. Economic value, the government has ways of calculating economic value, but this is in need of constant refreshment. Environmental value, that's generally measured in carbon, embodied carbon in the building, or the carbon it took to make it. But you have to also consider biodiversity. So they're quite well covered. But social value is a really, really undeveloped area and that we're working on at University of Reading, one which the government's taken a great deal of interest. And I think social value is really important to capturing the real value of land. If we can predict the value uplift that comes with a development, we can sell the land for more money, or we can make bonds or financial bonds to borrow money to enable developers to make more stuff. But we have to take the long-term view of these things and to try to work out what land really should cost, because I think that a lot of land has been given away, sold off much too cheaply, and the people who are making the money out of it are the developers, or those shareholders of those volume house builders, and that really somehow the authorities need to hang on to it. I put this picture in here because this is a classic thing at the moment. Local authorities are trying to build housing in every crevice and cranny they can find, particularly in London. So land is such a critical issue for housing, certainly down here in the southeast. But so I think that we need to capture the real value of land, and digital tools and other things are going to help us to do that, so that we can actually ask for the right amount of money, which takes into account the societal and other kinds of risks caused by a development. Because currently, the developer just goes off, does the development, and runs away, in many cases. And the council is left handling the cost of what's left behind. And you may be aware that there's a real public space. Nobody wants to look after public space or pay for the upkeep of public space. And that's another issue in all of this. So anyway, land is an issue. Coming back to the measuring of the social value. A project that we're doing, we've identified, through a lot of research, headline things that should be measured under this term social value, which you could call well-being as well. Running costs for people, freedom and flexibility, this makes people happier. Connecting, really, really important, part of the value of good design. Active lifestyles, you can make buildings that encourage people to get off their bottoms and go and do a bit of gardening or do this and that and the other. So important in this day and age. You can design buildings to foster positive emotions, to see trees, to see greenery. There's a lot of research now that shows that that reduces depression, you will heal better if you're in a hospital, all that sort of stuff. We need daylight, greenery around us, that kind of thing. And taking notice, it's a bit like mindfulness. You can design things to help people take notice of important things in their lives. And you can also design things that empower people by involving them in the making of their homes. And that makes a real difference because it makes people feel listened to, which is a very important starting moment. So we've come up with these high-level factors, and we are trying to generate monetized outcomes, so that we're putting a monetary value on these things, which is really important if you want to embed social value into policy and government activity. So this is a photograph of a consultation. This is Ellie, my research assistant, and we're down at Orts Road, which is the council estate opposite from Blake's Lock, and where we're doing work on revisioning Orts Road, which has been through quite a tough time. So we're using our social value indicators to start collecting people's opinions of what they like and value around the area, putting them onto maps, and actually starting to generate maps. So this, in a way, is a happy map of the residents of Orts Road, what they feel about the place, what they enjoy. And we found asking them questions about what makes them take notice, what they enjoy in their environment, took the conversation about worrying, the conversation in the situations generally about drug needles, dog mess, graffiti, antisocial behaviour. But it changed it round into a discussion of where people really love to be and how much they appreciate the canals of rivers in Reading. So these are first stages in these maps, which I think are going to have a lot of potential. So in summary, sorry about that, we have to be able to make informed decisions on how to invest and what works best for the people in the environment. And that's really key to this housing crisis thing, because if we use our money on things that are irrelevant and don't work, we've got a problem. We've got a big problem, and we're wasting money, and we're making long-term risk. So, some solutions. A really, really important solution is collaboration between people, between disciplines, to make better homes. So this is Lilac Co-Housing up in the north. And this was a self-build, self-generated project by the community. And I think the one thing that really, really kills collaboration is building contracts. Now, I don't want to get too boring about these, but we have to change the way buildings are procured to encourage these things. And I'll talk about why. So at the moment, a lot of buildings, most buildings, are built using a contract like this, a design and build contract, which essentially the building contractor is in charge of the whole team, including the architect, who's just a minion in the system, really, quite a lot of the time. But these building contracts are enormous, and a lot of people make money out of the grief and the misery and the conflict that goes on in these contracts. And you can imagine lots of lawyers' fees, lots of all of this stuff come in, because these contracts are about bits of people coming in and doing things in different stages, and within that there's huge room for error. And it sets people against each other, which is why building contracts stop people collaborating. We need to make new kinds of building contracts which are based on measurable outcomes, like social value, like environmental value, and so on. Rather than, and so a building, you just say, hey, I want a building that it will make people this much more happy and this much more environmental carbon, this is how much is going to be used. In a way, that could be the contract. And you may think that's a bit silly, or that's not going to happen, but it is happening as we speak. And these kind of contracts means that people work together, there's less waste, you produce a high quality project, and people are encouraged to innovate, to save money and to save on the process. So I was talking to one very large engineering company recently, and they said, hey, that they had done one of these performance outcomes-based contracts, and the building had been achieved before the due date, it had been achieved in less than the budget, and everyone was really, really happy with it. Obviously, it's an experimental thing, but I believe this is where we're going. Because the way that buildings are procured at the moment squishes out innovation, squishes out small companies, because it's all done about minimising risks. You have to have a gold-plated standard of insurance. You have to be an enormous giant company to take on anything. It's all terribly scary when you get to the land of building contracts. So we need outcomes-based building contracts, so we can transform the way buildings are procured. I'm sorry it all gets a bit technical, but then we get rid of these hefty contracts that encourage infighting and lawyers, and we introduce these outcomes-based things whereby people work together to achieve a good outcome. So there's been a big report, Procuring for Value, which is very important recently, on just this issue. Now, another reason we need these outcomes-based procurement is because the way that buildings are being delivered is really changing. A lot of buildings are being delivered, well, not a lot, more and more buildings are being made in factories and put on site. So you don't really need a big building contract for such a thing, because all you need is some groundwork. So you put the building there, bit of tweaking, and it's done. But at the moment, the people making these modular buildings are suffering because the contracts that we have are not fit for purpose. For basically, it's a bit like getting your IKEA kitchen or something fitted. You need something very, very different. So this is Anglia Water is an example of a very good client that deals with the world with this outcomes-based procurement. That what they care about is the environment, satisfied companies, customers, fair profits, investing for tomorrow, caring for communities. A much, much better way of doing business than just trying to control risk. We also need to make outcomes-based building contracts for building housing because we're going so digital. And we need to know how buildings are performing and how they fit into the city. So this is a picture of the digital twin. In a way, this is the digital twin. The idea of it is it's a virtual model of our cities and towns, and we're heading in that direction, where cities and towns will be modelled on computer to see how they perform and work and then we can test them before we actually build them, which should be a good thing. And one of the reasons I'm very concerned about social value is I hate the idea of a digital twin being built without any data to do with how happy people are and how much well-being there is. But if we deliver buildings that are around data and outcomes, then we can fit that data into these digital twins and life will be easier going forward. At the same time, and again I apologise for getting a bit technical, but I think the sort of nitty-gritty problems of the housing crisis are in these technical things. We need frameworks that allow innovation. Now you may say to yourself, what is a framework? In order to make it, organisations, they organise frameworks, they ask people to apply to come onto the framework. I'm sure University of Reading has one. And those organisations are on the framework, and if there's a job comes up, the university or whatever will just ask that somebody from the framework to do the job, and it makes life easier and simpler in some respects. But the problem is when those frameworks only allow really big and, again, gold-plated companies onto the framework. It means that only giant companies can get into doing any jobs. And it means that the little companies have no chance to grow. You get a really monotonous, homogeneous built environment when all the buildings are sort of the same, and you're not getting innovation coming through. So I put this picture of Pocket Living housing in West Green Place Nursery by HTA Design, because Pocket Living are a housing developer that appreciates the importance of being delicate around frameworks, and especially our very creative client that frames work in order to get innovation and to encourage SMEs and micro businesses to get their foothold onto the housing design and building ladder. So those are frameworks. So not good as well. So that's around collaboration. We need better contracts and we need better frameworks and ways of employing people. Affordability and supply. Right, okay. So, if you're a Daily Express reader, like my mother, you will get excited about these headlines, which tell you, house price rises, yay, 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 surge again. And that's considered to be success in the UK, where people see their house as an investment. But in somewhere like Germany, this would be seen to be disaster because it suggests that house prices are not under control, and house price surges directly fuel poverty because it leaves people behind. So we do have to think about housing differently, and I don't know how this is going to happen in the UK context where the home is a castle and all of that stuff. But we have to be happy when house prices aren't going up. Now, recently, in the news, that time that Theresa May did the ABBA dancing, she was coming to announce the fact that borrowing cap has been taken off local authorities so that they can start to develop housing again, which is brilliant. And there's amazing, innovative, gorgeous housing going on in local authorities. They were champing at the bit because they weren't allowed to borrow money to make housing happen, and off they go, and they're doing it, which is a really, really fantastic potential thing. But we still have right to buy. right to buy has been abolished in Scotland. Wales is abolishing it, but in the UK it's easier to buy your house under right to buy. So what's the point of producing all these lovely cheap council housing or affordable housing or whatever you want to call them if they're just going to be flogged off too cheap and then you're back in the same situation? I characterise it rather extremely, but that's slightly what's going on here. Another solutions, technology and innovation. This has got to help. So this is a Chinese prefabrication company, and China's chucking out modules for housing like nobody's business. There are great big container ships outside certain countries like Argentina just waiting to deliver whole cities. It's just extraordinary and scary. I mean, I exaggerate not. It sort of upsets the market within the country, though. But we are heading towards this pick and mix world where you can build your housing like you can choose your kitchen. This is modular custom build. You can choose a house with components and then you can put them up. There's a blanket planning permission that says if you build it from this house from this set of kit of parts, then you can build it without planning permission. And this is going on in places like Camborne in Cornwall. And I think this is the way it has to go. And there are some famous developments in the Netherlands, which are these quite diverse places, and they're quite exciting. So more modular construction factories are being built, but they require investment and a guarantee of more contracts. And we were just talking about Legal and General, Sam and I, and here they are, they've got their modular home factory. They've really gone out and invested, and they're trying to produce these homes, which of course are quicker to make, they're cheaper to make, they're much higher quality because they're built in a factory. And I don't know if you're aware, there's a terrible crisis around the construction industry. Nobody wants to go into the construction industry, nobody wants to learn trades, any of this stuff. So I think maybe we're getting to a point when houses are going to be made in factories, more like a kind of, your phone or something like that. More technology is going to go into them. And I just think that the generation here, I mean, who here was brought up on SimCity? Yeah, quite a few of you. Generation who are used to constructing their own cities and their houses and computer games and whatnot. It's just going to be completely a no-brainer, natural that you're going to go and try and want to make your own house. And so this is a system which is 3D printing, when you sort of essentially spray material to make something. 3D printing technology is really taking off. 3D printing houses made of wood, chips, all sorts of things, concrete are happening at the moment. And this is a laboratory in Umeå University in Sweden, and I like this laboratory because it's freely available to citizens and universities, so you can laser cut your Christmas decoration in there if you want to, but at the same time this is where they're making the first 3D printed sawdust house in some huge European project. So innovation is definitely going to be part of it, but it requires investment. So there's lots of speculation, and it's not going to be too long before we live in these 3D printed homes. But let's hope that they're going to be good designs. And robotics and so on are really, really starting to become commonplace in the construction industry. You may be familiar with Zaha Hadid's architecture. This is a robot working on experimenting on the surface of a building. So it's getting extremely space age. So technology will help us to produce more houses more fast. But we have to do that sustainably. And this is one of my real beefs. I mean, I've mentioned how important how much the construction industry produces all manner of pollution. Housing is responsible for a quarter of greenhouse gases. So the Code for Sustainable Homes was put in place in 2006 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And for a little blissful moment, it was mandatory until it ceased to be a requirement in 2010. So all the volume house builders were moving towards having to make zero carbon homes. It was a fantastic moment, but it stopped. But regulation is needed if we are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in any kind of meaningful way. We can't have so much deregulation as we've had of late. And we also have to consider in our housing biodiversity, the birds, bees, all of these things. The mass extinction that we have going on at the moment is monstrous. And it is starting to be taken seriously. Here's the London Assembly, at home with nature, encouraging biodiversity and new housing developments. They are also residents of our buildings. I just want to mention post-occupancy evaluation. Now, post-occupancy evaluation is when you go back to a building to see if it works. Now, sadly, as few as 3% of architects do post-occupancy evaluation. Sometimes I do a talk and the people say, oh, as much as that. And it's shocking. You'd hate to think that your doctor wasn't paying attention to the fact whether the medicine had worked that they'd given to you. It's a shocking thing. But it's not just architects' fault. It's the fact architects' fees are as little as 0% sometimes. Architects' fees are being totally driven down. Anyway, they're only responsible for 90% of the environment. So nobody really knows what works in the built environment. So without knowing what works, we just can't improve anything. And this will take cross-industry action to make sure that we're monitoring, doing and measuring. And it comes back to the thing I was talking about performance-based outcomes. Because without working out whether things work, we just can't make any sound decisions. It's just like making a business without a strategy or building a house on jelly. What is the point? Okay, so sustainability, vital. If you don't consider sustainability, you're just storing up risks and costs for somebody else. It might not be for you, but it's for somebody else. Another solution, placemaking. Placemaking has become a very kind of groovy word around urban cities, and we're interested in research around placemaking at the School of Architecture here in Reading. But it's about making places, about making community spaces, places that feel they have an identity, a place that you call your home. And the Design Council has produced a very interesting report which shows how much impact good placemaking can have on health outcomes, which is really important. And I note, and healthy placemaking, taking care with the design of cities, makes a real difference for kids, whether they get to play out, that sort of thing. I notice in London now they're really starting to try to encourage active lifestyles in terms of transportation because of the health outcomes around that. But healthy placemaking is also about making opportunities for older people to get out and have pleasant lives, independent lives, people of not just older people, anyone, but also growing food. Urban food production is really important. And I love this example. This is Incredible Edible in Todmorden, which is a town in Yorkshire, which basically all the public space, all the place where they have municipal gardening and things has been turned into edible gardens. And so this is outside the police station where they're growing sweet corn. And that food is available for anybody who wants to pick it. And actually the residents at Orts Road that we were working with, they want to do this in Orts Road. And we're very excited about this. It's going to be just great. But that comes from good design and good placemaking. So, I mean, here's just an example, and I'm sure you recognise Kevin MacLeod. I think some housing developers are really recognising the value of placemaking. And of course it makes it more desirable, and you can probably sell the house for more as well while you're at it. So this is Liveworks in Sheffield. We set this up when I was head in Sheffield, and this is in a disused shop in the middle of Sheffield, and it's used as a place for doing placemaking with the university, with the community, and with industry and practice. And we're in the process, we've just been given the official tick that at the School of Architecture we're having an urban room like this. We are an urban room in Reading, and you will be noticing lots of little things, pavilions and whatnot, are developing around the place as a result of our mission to make a permanent urban room in Reading, to help people get involved in the design of the city and help with placemaking here. So we're part of this organisation, the Place Alliance, which I just want to do a little plug for that. I was very proud of that. It's exciting. Okay, so placemaking, really, really important. It's a very holistic thing, this housing crisis. Leadership, last of all, I would say. I don't know if you're aware, this is an interesting statistic. Between 1945 and 1960, there were 4 housing ministers. 15 years, there were 4 housing ministers. From between 2010 and 2018, there have been 8 ministers. serving on average one a year, with the last post for 6 months. So we have a housing minister every 6 months. How can they get their teeth into this incredibly critical problem? And I just, this is a graph, you may not really be able to read it very much, but you could just take it from me that this line here shows how much local authority spending has been reduced on everything except for car parking. That, cut. Housing renewal, minus 69%. Between, well, you can read it yourself. But I show this, architects tend to not like planners very much, and always muttering about planners, they wouldn't let me get my planning permission, etc., etc. But I'm really, really completely on the side of planners. We really do need healthy, resourced, and highly skilled planning departments in our local authorities to make really good decisions about what should be made, to be very, very strategic, to deliver integrated transportation, to be visionary in the way that planners used to be so long ago. The way that planning departments are now, it's going to be very hard to deliver anything. So that, in a way, is the #1 priority. So other people have taken it into their own hands, and this is a really nice example, the older women's co-housing, working with PTE architects. They wanted somewhere to live in their older age, they want somewhere that wanted to live together, and have made this fantastic place. So much nicer than that horrible place I showed you, which I took the photograph over my dashboard at the weekend. I really know where I would rather be. And I'm sure, so I think that people are going to start feeling more empowered to build their own homes as they would like them to be. So, on that note, I just want to show you a little film that we made as part of a research project when I was in Sheffield to talk about really self-build and how, maybe the leadership we need is us.
In the UK, our housing needs are not being met. We are not building enough homes. Over the last 20 years, the UK has increasingly come to depend on a small number of large volume house builders, a well-structured industry. When the market is booming, it delivers housing in large chunks. Why? Now, more people are getting together and thinking about what they actually need rather than what the house builders want to give them, focusing on the livability of a home instead of the short-term appeal of a market product. Because building your own place doesn't have to be something only the well-off can consider. The National Planning Policy Framework places a duty on local authorities to measure and provide for the demand of those that wish to build their own homes. A pilot custom-build revolving loan fund via the government's Homes and Communities Agency provides access to short-term development finance for multi-unit custom-build schemes. Innovation is sweeping across the housing sector, with collective custom build as a central strand. Groups with shared needs and interests can coalesce through crowd and cloud technology, unlocking powerful new ways to channel energy and finance projects that have never existed before. Off-site manufacture of houses gives a greater consistency in build quality and performance and quicker build times, further reducing risk for self-builders and their partners, priming a local knowledge base of skills and post-industrial development. In other countries, it is quite usual to be more involved in the design and build of your own home, and it is becoming more so here. The number of self-built homes in the UK already matches the output of any of our biggest house builders. With collective custom build, individual self-builders combine to take advantage of the opportunities that come from working together. Homes built collectively benefit from economies of scale and shared access to supply chains, and build future neighbourhoods based on mutual support and the sharing of risk. Such interconnected neighbourhoods deliver benefits in health, education and social cohesion. Collective custom build groups are enabled by partnership between local authorities, registered providers, developers, house builders or other third sector organisations, and the local support so needed to secure planning permissions. With sales guaranteed up front, collective custom build can act as a financial catalyst, a pre-financed starter phase for more traditional housing projects, a productive seedbed. Collective custom build can unlock home building opportunities on challenging sites, the kind of sites only too familiar to many local authorities and their developer partners. Self-builders are free to think more imaginatively about, say, a large edge-of-town greenfield site, typically anonymous and badly connected, looking for an identity and sense of place. A collective custom build development reaches out to surrounding neighbours and builds a new, distinct community, harnessing the potential of shared space. On smaller dispersed sites, such as urban brownfield land or the industrial fringes of rural areas, collective custom builders enjoy the opportunity to build dense developments of unconventionally shaped homes, cheek by jowl with existing buildings and infrastructure, creating an intriguing new quarter in the city. Or through re-inhabiting an existing building. There are custom builders searching for a genuine historical connection and sense of place, and the cracking of an otherwise doomed piece of heritage. Momentum is building with cross-party enthusiasm and flagship developments coming forward. Strong local leadership clears the path for pioneering projects. More and more people are getting together and making things happen on the ground, and central government seems to be listening. Collective custom build, an idea whose time has come.
Okay, so I hope that makes you feel inspired. And indeed, that's a couple of years old, this film, but enthusiasm from government for custom build as a real alternative to what's going on with the volume house builders continues to grow apace. Okay. If I can
In the UK, our housing
want it
needs
again.
are not being met.
There we are. Conclusion. Right, whistle-stop tour of the world of housing. I think that in order to solve our housing crisis, we need to make a housing system based on what works. That seems pretty obvious, but at the moment we don't know what works, so we don't know where to spend our money and we don't know where to put our resources, resulting with the most ridiculous amount of waste. And in order to do that, we need to say, what is design value? So we can say, this is what we aspire to, this is what is good, this is what makes a good home. We need to change the way housing is procured to promote quality and collaboration. We need to get rid of those big fat building contracts that encourage hostility, litigation and all these sorts of things, and we need to move towards simple contracts that just say, I want this building to deliver this level of sustainability and this level of social value, for example, and to cost this much. We need to tackle affordability in a holistic way, as it's a systemic problem. I work with in the UK Collaborative Housing Evidence Centre, which is very much dominated by social scientists. You just can't, in that mixture, a home becomes just a unit or a number or something. It just can't be dealt with as a home is much, much more than a unit or a number or something that you make an equation about. We have to support innovation to produce houses efficiently and cheaply. Amazing things are going on, and amazing debates are going on about if we're making these modular houses, should we make them look new, should we make them look old, should we make them look pseudo-vernacular, all those sorts of things. We've got people working on those sort of areas, research. Apparently in terms of taste and what kind of house people would like to live in, they want to live in a kind of homely modern. Homely modern is the word we've got going for how contemporary 21st century people would generally like their home to look. And we have to include the environment in any decisions we make about value and how a house development should be. Most of all, we need to plan healthy places that promote happiness and save money. I mean, you may be aware of social prescribing on the National Health Service now. People joke about, oh, they prescribed people to go and walk around a park for a certain amount of time or be in some green or whatever. But the reason that social prescribing is taking off in the National Health Service is because it works. And communities and housing have an amazing role to play in that transformation. So to do all of these things, to work together, to make robust and desirable, well-designed homes, we need regulation. And we need regulation to keep standards up so we don't all race to the bottom on the most minimal standard of home. And in order for that to happen, we need to have support for planners, because those planners are the people who are going to check that those things are happening and can reinforce the importance of keeping up standards. And standards are what we need, because it's not just about numbers of homes, it's about the quality of those homes. And what makes a good home is a very mysterious thing, because people will put up with a house that leaks if they think it's beautiful. So there are all sorts of mysterious things that happen in the whole of in the housing research world. It's just nothing's very straightforward in all of that. But beauty, and the government's had launched a big beauty commission for housing recently. The way that houses look is really important for how people feel. And we have to be serious about the designs of our homes. I think one of the housing ministers actually said, we should be creating the conservation areas of the future. And I think he's absolutely right. So I'll finish there and hand back over to Sam.
Brilliant, thank you, Flora. We've got a few minutes for some questions. Now, we've got 2 people with microphones that are going to be sort of roving around. So it would be really great if you could pop your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you, and I'll try and sort of spread us around. So I saw the gentleman here, first of all, if we could start there, and then we'll go for the gentleman there next.
Right. Flora mentioned once or twice in passing how they do things in Germany. I believe at the root of the problem, certainly with housing, I'm not talking about development generally, but with housing, is that it's become a financial asset rather than a place to live. My understanding, and I may be mistaken, is that in Germany they limit price rises because they centralise the notion that this is somewhere to live and it's not a financial asset. Surely that is actually mainly the root of the problems that we have. But how we get back down from where we are to somewhere like they have in Germany. I mean, I'll just finish by saying I was struck when I was in Germany some years ago. I went to a new housing estate and it didn't look remotely like the rabbit hutches that Barratt built, the hideous rabbit hutches. They were apparently, and this is normal in Germany, people go to architects who actually have a range of houses that are architect designed, not by technicians who aren't architects. And so you get a diversity of appearance of well-designed houses. As I said, the whole system is predicated that these are places to live and are not merely financial assets. We really, and in so many things, but not in everything, we should do as the Germans do.
So Flora, I think the question there was, would you agree with that?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. I think we were at the top here, yeah.
Hi there, Flora. It's Paul here. I'm from Bristol.
Hello.
And I'm pleased to tell you that yesterday the local authority, they produced their local plan. They launched it yesterday and they identified 5% of future residential development will be self-built, which I think is fabulous. But the numbers were quite disappointing. I don't know what you think. For the size of Bristol, they're going to look at doing 33,000 homes over the next 26 years. So I don't know if that's a good number, but news from Bristol.
Well, it's a start. I mean, the thing I find an absolute shocker is that people might say they're going to produce this many homes and this many affordable homes, but nobody's actually counting to see if they did. So that's a slight segue off your subject, but yeah, even if a certain amount of affordable homes are earmarked, they don't even happen necessarily. But it's good that the self-build's included in that, and thank you for coming all the way from Bristol.
Thank you. Anybody in, so gentleman in the blue sweater here? And do I have someone from this block as the next one? So gentleman also in the blue sweater in the middle here is next, please.
Yes, I'm a retired town planner, so nice words from planners from you, which is good, and I love architects.
Oh, good.
Two things I totally agree with, first of all. The right to buy has been a total disaster in terms of the supply of social housing. And secondly, this whole obsession with what we call the housing ladder over here, and housing being an investment rather than a place to live, I totally agree with. I totally agree that planners should be allowed to plan positively. We used to do so. Now I think planners spend their time trying to keep on check on what other people are doing rather than actually positively plan. And following on that, in order to achieve the sort of huge numbers we need, do you think again there is a role for going back to the old garden cities, or properly planned new settlements?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, there are garden cities being developed now, and a big issue around this whole land thing is, of course, that NIMBYism, nobody wants a development in their backyard, but maybe it's partly because the developments are so horrible. That could have something to do with it. So I think, yeah, I mean, there are garden cities happening. When they're well connected with transport, they make absolute sense. And it's definitely something the government's looking at and doing. And I think it is somewhere we have to go. But we should, first of all, use all available site near transportation at the heart of towns. So it's a multi-pronged thing, isn't it? It's densifying cities near transportation links. But we are also going to have, we have to plan settlements. What an exciting prospect that is, if done well.
Thank you. So here, a gentleman here next, and gentleman in the grey, fourth row up after that, please.
Yes, the university here is the single biggest landowner housing developer in the Reading sub-region, and has been for many years. So you have a ready-made laboratory looking to the future to up the university's game, because the standard model is bring the land forward and flog it off to the volume house builders, and you can see this going on university land all around Reading. So are you and your chief financial officer working together to build a real estate strategy which takes in all these exciting new innovative approaches that you've outlined for us today?
I'll let you take that one for
Sam and I have met for the first time tonight, but I have a general amazingly big beef with universities, not Reading, about their estate strategy, which in many, many cases is unbelievably primitive. And they don't, and they love making a lot of money out of architecture students, but they don't value architects and they don't value good design in their estates. So not Reading, it's nothing to do with Reading. Universities I have experienced elsewhere. So I think doing good design uplifts the brand of the university. It attracts good researchers and people to work there. It attracts students. It attracts people to the town. So we are working on research, and here somewhere in the room, around how good design really there's a real business case for good design for universities. We can talk about it another day.
But no, okay. I think gentleman here was next, please, and then gentleman in the grey there. Sorry, it's gentleman wearing blue seems to be the theme of the evening. So on the front row here.
Do you want to encourage running?
No, please don't. No.
Hello, I'm Melvin from Reading. I come from an engineering background, 35 years local authority in the built environment, so found it quite interesting. Procurement. You hit on procurement. I was a procurement officer in part in my last 2 years procuring a £30 million contract. But on the engineering side, collaborative contracts under the NEC terms of contract have been in place now 10 years, performance-based, and they do work. I'm surprised JCT hasn't moved forward.
Yes.
And they're a bit behind, obviously. One thing you also mentioned was frameworks. Frameworks are a good idea because they get over the OJU and the European procurement side in terms of getting the framework of your list of suppliers and then going to them. But the problem is we found with that was it wasn't necessarily the most competitive way as opposed to single spot tendering. But then local authorities always went for lowest bid. and that doesn't necessarily bring in the quality aspect. So you're absolutely right, it is a totally holistic approach that has to be taken, and a balance has to be struck to try and tick all the boxes. But it's not easy.
No.
Any thoughts on the procurement routes?
Well, I think that it's really good to hear about engineering, and I talk about performance-based procurement with colleagues here at Reading, and they say, no, never going to happen. And then I talk to other people, and they say, why are turkeys going to vote for Christmas? You know, so actually, there are a lot of people with vested interests in these ornate contracts, but I think it's all going to be disrupted by technology tomorrow. So, you know, people who are ahead of the game on that are going to win.
I mean, it's interesting because
Take the mic.
yeah, under the the current procurement regulations with Europe, it is so restrictive, and once you get over the value, you have to go through the full EU process of getting that procurement in place. It cuts out the local people.
Exactly.
And that is what's so damaging now with the local communities. We're supposed to be encouraging local business, local communities to participate, and it prevents that. So
Yeah, I couldn't agree
there may
more.
be a positive with Brexit, who knows?
Thank you. So we're going to ask the gentleman in grey here, but it would be super if we might have a question from a lady in the audience next, just as we, not wearing a blue sweater would be lovely, so I'll just leave that with you. Gentleman here first.
Great presentation. Can I
Thank
ask,
you.
do a challenge and a question?
Okay.
So you talked about outcome-based procurement, but shouldn't that be outcome-based performance so that the homeowner has certainty in terms of the performance of their building,
Yes.
not in terms of the way it's constructed? And then if you take that argument forward, surely with Zoopla, etc., you could demonstrate this performance of this building achieves this. And if it doesn't, there's a commitment on the design team to come back and fix it. And so you're creating a procurement process which has certainty in it. So that's my challenge. My
I think
question,
it couldn't be more right, yeah.
I suppose, you talked about the code, the 2007 code.
Yes, yeah.
Isn't that the heart of the issue, that in 2014, when the government went through the Housing Standards Review, they removed all the red tape, so they got rid of secure by design, they got rid of the code.
Yes.
So is this the issue that the current government believes self-regulation in the housing industry is acceptable, where you talk about standards, but shouldn't it be regulations that we need more of and have certainty in terms of how regulations change over time? Is that not the heart of the issue?
Well, yes, regulation is because people will not self-regulate. It just doesn't happen. And I think the government's alive to this issue. You know, in a couple of white papers ago, you know, it admitted that the housing market was broken. There's a lot of discussion around this territory of it is regulation, but yeah, that's what it is. But I really love this idea about the sort of, I think houses, you know, we have these coloured bands like you have on refrigerators. I think we're going to have them with our, you know, we get those rubbishy ones that estate agents give us, but we're going to need real ones that give real performance. And I think this comes back to this post-occupancy coming back. Did it work? And increasingly people are going to be put on their phones saying, a rotten house, it's doing this, and developing a whole mobile phone sort of data push towards whether they're happy with buildings or not. This is what's happening in the build-to-rent sector. People are, you know, it goes on mobile phones, TripAdvisor, don't go and live in this place. And
it also picks up what was coming out of the Grenfell inquiry in terms of design versus actual. So
yes.
what was designed and what was actually delivered is different. If you actually have that performance gap, either for fire or energy or for water, surely that solves the problem.
Yeah. Well, there's enormous performance gap. So between what people model, they do all these digital models to say what a building's going to do, and what actually happens is completely an enormous gap. But some architectural practices do a lot of post-occupancy evaluation and have managed to close that gap almost to the point they can guarantee the performance of their building, and that's where we have to go.
Okay, so we have a lady here, but I'm coming back round to you, the rest of the ladies in the audience. The pressure's not off. Please go ahead.
I did want to ask a question as a lady in the audience, but a member of staff of the university as well. Thank you, Flora. I just wanted to make the point about design, and you mentioned about housing for different generations, but there are design initiatives such as Lifetime Homes, which are actually about designing specifically to accommodate people as they travel through and have different challenges or their life changes. So I think that this issue of design is an important consideration, not just to do with the aesthetics of housing, but also to do with thinking about how people live and how their expectations and requirements change. So design is not just a kind of visual thing, but it's also about how we accommodate people's different lifestyles and people's different changes over their lifetime. So it's just a point about design being more than just the aesthetic, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But again, it comes back down to the fact that most housing is being built for the lowest common denominator, cheapest form. It's an interesting one with lifetime homes, whether you would like to have all your corridors a certain size and so on, your doorways ready for when you enter a wheelchair and all of that stuff. Not necessarily everybody wants it. But yeah, design is not just about aesthetics. For me, it's about saving money and saving resources and saving happiness.
There's a lady over here, sorry, and then I'm going to go back. Lady in the red, and then gentleman in the blue shirt up here next. Sorry, there's two gentlemen in blue shirts. We'll do those next.
Reading is looking to meet most of its housing needs through high-rise for fairly obvious reasons. How can Reading best ensure the social value of that housing, including affordable housing?
Well, research suggests that there's nothing inherently wrong with high-rise. You know, there's a lot of very rich people who love living in high-rise developments, aren't there? It depends whether they're maintained properly and the lifts work and they have a door, lock on the door quite often. So I think the thing is that people shouldn't have to live in things that they don't want to live in. So they shouldn't be put in high-rise if they don't want to live in high-rise. But I think you have to weigh up the economics with the social value to try and achieve the best amount of, well, the best possible homes for people in circumstances, I suppose. And so that it will inevitably be a mix of kinds of developments. But there has to be placemaking at the heart of that. And well-designed towers will have well-designed landscapes which offer places where people can congregate, take exercise, and enjoy their lives. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Gentleman here, yeah.
Hi. As part of the SimCity generation, when you say build and design your own house, I'm all in on that. But how can the barrier to entry for self-build be reduced for first-time buyers, in your opinion?
Well, we've got PhD students working here at the University of Reading, actually, on developing financial instruments, financial journeys with banks to make it easier for people to self-build and first-time buyers. There are ways that you can do trade-offs with long-term value. I mean, you can be clever about it, is what I'm saying. But in London, what's considered affordable is actually totally unaffordable in relation to what people's wages are. Something drastic has to happen to do this. And actually, I did mean to mention, you know, that the government put in this sort of bit of money to encourage new young people to come onto the housing market. You know, a bit of cash in their which of course inflated prices immediately. And a volume house builder I was talking to said, ka-ching. You know, so that is not the way to do it.
Okay. And what will probably our last question, I'm afraid, is the gentleman in the check shirt towards the back.
Thank you. I was a student here 40 years ago, and I did my final year dissertation on the right to buy. So 4 decades on, I'm really interested that you picked up on leadership as a big issue, and I completely agree with you. It seems to me like it's the big missing ingredient of making this happen at scale. So apart from your point about that kind of crowdsourced leadership from all of us, I just wonder where else you think we might look for that, because politics isn't looking too good.
God. Well, you'd have to change the political system. I feel like asking some of the students in here, whether another way is coming forth for us. No, it's a question for civil society. I'm afraid I can't answer it.
Okay. On that note, so ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Flora Samuel for that fascinating talk.